A 6-year-old boy told his mother terrible things about his stepfather, so she decided to check by hiding under the bed. But what she saw filled her with rage. Gina closed the door to her house with a sense of relief. Another workday had come to an end. She took off her shoes and walked barefoot down the hallway, enjoying the coolness of the floor under her tired feet. "Sweetheart, where are you?" she called, but there was no answer. She frowned and headed to the kitchen. On the table, she found a note written in her 6-year-old son's messy handwriting. "Mom, I'm in my room. I don't want dinner." Gina's heart began to race as she climbed the stairs. Something was wrong. Matthew never refused dinner. She knocked softly on his bedroom door. "Matthew, can I come in?" Silence. "I'm coming in." She slowly opened the door. The room was dark, lit only by the dim light seeping in from the hallway. "Sweetheart," she whispered. A muffled sob came from the corner. Gina turned on the light and saw her son curled up between the bed and the wall. "Honey," she said, kneeling beside him. "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" Matthew lifted his head. His eyes were swollen and red. "No, I can't tell you," he said, shaking his head. Gina felt her heart clench. "You know you can tell me anything. We'll fix this together." The boy shook his head again, his face tense. "I can't. He'll kill me if I say anything." Gina froze. "Sweetheart, tell me who it is. Who's threatening you?" Matthew buried his face in his knees. "No one. Forget about it." Gina gently touched his cheeks. "No one will hurt you. I'm your mom, and I'll always protect you. Please tell me what's going on." Matthew looked up at her, his eyes full of fear. "It's Norman." Gina felt like she had been punched in the stomach. "What are you saying? What did he do to you?" Matthew looked away. "He hurts me when you're not around." "This can't be," Gina shook her head in shock. "It must be a misunderstanding. Your stepfather loves you." "But that's not true," Matthew shouted, pulling away sharply. "You never believed me. That's why I didn't want to tell you anything." "Wait, sweetheart." Gina started, but the boy had already crawled under his blanket and turned away. Gina sat on the floor, holding her head in her hands. This can't be happening, she thought. Norman had always seemed like a good man. He was caring, kind, or had she just wanted to believe that? She slowly stood up and left the room, closing the door behind her. She needed to think. Downstairs in the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water, trying to calm down. How is this possible? The question swirled in her mind. She had lived with Norman for almost 3 years and was sure she knew him. The sound of the front door opening snapped her back to reality. "Honey, I'm home!" Norman's cheerful voice echoed in the hallway. Gina took a deep breath, forcing herself to keep a calm expression. She couldn't let him suspect anything. Norman walked into the kitchen with a smile. "How was your day, darling?" He leaned in to kiss her, but she instinctively pulled away. Norman's smile tightened. "Is something wrong?" Gina shook her head, trying to smile. "No, just tired. It was a long day." Norman frowned, looking at her with concern. "Do you want me to order something for dinner? Then you won't have to cook." "No thanks. I don't have an appetite," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Actually, I think I'll go to bed early." "Are you sure you're okay?" Norman reached for her shoulder, but she stepped back again. "Yeah, I just need some rest." Gina turned toward the door. "Good night." "Wait," Norman said. "Where's Matthew?" "I wanted to show him something I bought for him." Gina stopped, gripping the doorframe. "He's sleeping. He's not feeling well." "Oh, that's too bad. Do you want me to check on him?" "No!" Gina blurted out before she could stop herself. She turned and saw the surprised look on Norman's face. "I mean, there's no need to wake him up. You'll see him tomorrow." Without waiting for a reply, she rushed upstairs to her bedroom, shutting the door behind her. She collapsed onto the bed, her heart pounding. What do I do now, she thought. The next few days were torture for Gina. Every time she saw Norman interacting with Matthew, she watched closely, analyzing every word, every movement, searching for the slightest hint of something sinister. But everything seemed normal. Norman was just as caring and patient as ever. However, Gina noticed that Matthew had become more withdrawn and quieter. He no longer ran to Norman when he came home from work like he used to. One evening, while Gina was making dinner, she decided to talk to Matthew. She found him in his room, quietly drawing. "Hey, sweetheart, can I come in?" Matthew nodded without looking up from his drawing. Gina sat next to him on the bed. "What are you drawing?" "Nothing," Matthew whispered, covering his picture with his hand. Gina sighed. "Matthew, we need to talk about what you told me the other day. You know you can tell me anything." Matthew's hand froze. He took a deep breath and whispered, "I don't want to talk about it. I understand that it's hard, but I need to know what happened. Can you tell me?" Matthew shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "Please, sweetheart, I'm your mom. I want to help you. I need to know the truth." The boy looked at her, fear and a sense of resignation in his eyes. "Do you promise you won't get mad?" "I promise, my love. I won't get mad, no matter what you say." Matthew took a deep breath and began to speak in a whisper. "Sometimes when you're not home, Norman comes into my room. He says he wants to play with me, but his games scare me." Gina felt her blood run cold. "What kind of games, Matthew?" "Games where he has to touch me," Matthew whispered, staring at the floor. "He says it's normal, that all dads play like this with their kids, but I know it's not true. It makes me feel bad." Gina had to use all her strength not to scream. She was shocked by what she was hearing. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm for Matthew's sake. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Matthew looked at her with guilt in his eyes. "Norman said that if I told you, you'd get upset and leave us. He said it would be my fault if our family fell apart." Gina hugged Matthew tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Sweetheart, this is not your fault. You are so brave for telling me this." "Mom, what are we going to do now?" Matthew asked, his voice trembling. Gina pulled away and looked into his eyes. "We're getting out of here, I promise, but I need you to be brave and trust me." Matthew nodded and hugged her tightly. "Okay," Gina said, trying to steady her voice. "Pack your things, clothes, your favorite toys. We're leaving." "But where are we going?" Matthew asked, looking at her in surprise. "To Grandma's for a few days." "What about Norman?" he asked. Gina clenched her fists. "Don't worry about him. I'll take care of everything." While Matthew packed, Gina went to her room and called her mother. "Mom, I need your help. Matthew and I are coming to stay with you. I'll explain everything when we get there." Then she called her friend Karen. "Karen, I need you to pick us up. It's urgent." About half an hour later, Gina and Matthew were in Karen's car, heading toward her mother's house. "Are you sure you don't want me to call the police?" Karen asked, clearly concerned. "Not yet," Gina shook her head. "I need proof. I want to be sure, and I don't want to put Matthew through that stress right now." "So what are you going to do?" Gina stared out the window, her face serious and determined. "I'm going to get that proof, no matter what it takes." The days at Grandma's house were a relief for Matthew. Slowly, he started smiling again, playing as if everything had gone back to normal. Gina watched him with a sense of relief, but the pain in her heart never faded. Every time Norman called, she made up excuses, telling him that Matthew was sick, that her mother needed help. One afternoon, while Matthew played outside, Gina sat with her mother in the kitchen. "Mom, I need to tell you something," she said, trying to find the right words. Her mother looked at her with concern. "What's going on, honey? You haven't been yourself." Gina took a deep breath and told her everything. Her mother listened in silence, her face shifting from horror to fury. "That monster!" she exclaimed when Gina finished. "We have to report him immediately." "It's not that simple," Gina answered tiredly. "I need proof. Of course I believe my son, but Norman acts so kind around him. I need to be sure." "And what are you going to do?" her mother asked, worried. "I'm going back home, alone. I'll find the proof." "You're crazy," her mother said. "That's dangerous." "It's the only way," Gina said firmly. "I need you to stay with Matthew. Tell him I had to go back to work for a few days." Her mother looked at her with concern. "I don't like this plan, but I know I can't stop you. Please, be careful." Gina nodded and hugged her mother tightly before going outside to say goodbye to Matthew. "You're leaving, Mom?" the boy asked, his eyes sad. "Just for a few days, sweetheart," she said, stroking his hair. "I need to take care of some things at work, but I'll be back soon." "Are you going back to Norman?" Matthew asked fearfully. Gina hugged him. "No, my love. You don't have to worry about him anymore." I promised. That night, Gina returned home. Norman greeted her with a mix of relief and mild frustration. Finally, I was starting to worry. Why didn't you answer my calls? Gina forced a smile. Sorry, Mom wasn't feeling well, and I was really busy. Where's Matthew? Norman frowned. He's still at Mom's. The doctor said he should rest for a few more days. Norman looked slightly irritated but nodded. And you? You're staying here? Yes, I need to go back to work, Gina replied. Gina spent the night without sleep, thinking through her plan. She knew she had to be careful and cold-blooded. In the morning, she prepared breakfast, trying to make it look like a normal morning. Norman walked into the kitchen, smiling. Good morning, darling, he said, approaching her. She forced herself not to pull away. Good morning, Gina replied with a strained smile. Would you like some coffee? Of course. Please make me some, he said, sitting at the table. How's Matthew? Norman asked. He's better, Gina lied. The doctor says he needs to rest for a few more days. Norman frowned. Don't you think that's a bit much? It's just a cold, he said with reproach. The doctor knows what he's talking about, Gina replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Norman shrugged. All right. I miss him, though. I hope he comes back soon. Gina struggled to keep herself from screaming. Instead, she said, I miss him too, but he'll be home soon. Once Norman left, Gina got to work. She searched the house for any evidence that could confirm Matthew's story. Despair overwhelmed her. There was nothing suspicious anywhere. She sat on the couch feeling utterly helpless. What now, she thought. But then, an idea struck her. It was risky, dangerous even, but it might work. Later that day, when Norman called to say he would be late, Gina put her plan into action. She called Matthew. Hi, sweetheart, she said when he picked up. How are you? I'm okay, Mom. When are you coming back? He asked. Soon, honey, very soon, she promised. I need you to do something very important for me. What is it, Mom? Matthew asked, his voice filled with concern. Gina took a deep breath. I need you to call Norman and tell him you'll be coming home tomorrow. But that's not true. Or do I really have to come back? Matthew's voice trembled with fear. No, my love. You're not coming back yet, but I need Norman to think that you are. Can you do that for me? Matthew hesitated for a long moment before whispering, Okay, I'll do it. Thank you, sweetheart. You're so brave. I promise everything will be all right. When Gina hung up, she knew she had just set something reckless in motion, but it was all for her son. That night, when she heard Norman's car pull into the garage, she was already in position. She hid under Matthew's bed, her heart pounding so loudly she was afraid Norman would hear it. She listened as he climbed the stairs, stopped in front of the door, and then opened it. Matthew? Norman called softly, but no one answered. So you're coming home tomorrow, he murmured sadly. Gina held her breath. Norman walked to the bed and sat on the edge. She could see his feet and felt her stomach twist in fear and disgust. I've missed you so much, little one, Norman muttered. Tomorrow we'll play our special game again, just like always. Our little secret. Gina felt sick. She wanted to rush out and attack him, but she knew it wasn't time yet. She needed more proof. Norman stood up and walked to the closet. He opened it and pulled something from deep inside. Gina couldn't see what it was, but she heard the rustling of pages. Our little hiding spot, he whispered, flipping through the pages. So many memories. Our secret. Gina's blood ran cold. She couldn't wait any longer. She shot out from under the bed. Leave that alone, she shouted. Norman spun around, his face frozen in shock and horror. Gina, what are you doing here? He asked, stunned. Gina was trembling with rage. What am I doing here? What are you doing here? In my son's room, talking about secrets and special games, she screamed. Norman's face turned pale. It's not what you think, he stammered. I can explain. Explain how you terrorized my son? How you made him afraid? How you abused him? Norman took a step back, clutching whatever he was holding against his chest. You don't understand. Matthew and we have a special bond. He loves me. He's a child, Gina shouted. An innocent child you tormented. Norman's expression darkened. His voice turned cold and threatening. You have no proof. Who do you think they'll believe? A hysterical mother or a loving stepfather? Gina smirked coldly and pulled out her phone. Actually, I do have proof. I recorded everything the moment you walked into this room. Fear flashed across Norman's face. You... you couldn't have. I did. She took a step closer. Now give me whatever you're holding, and then get out of my house forever. No! Norman yelled, lunging toward the door. Gina tackled him, grabbing onto his clothes as they both crashed to the floor, struggling over the album in his hands. During the struggle, the album fell to the ground and flew open. Gina froze in horror at the photographs inside. Norman took advantage of her shock and tried to escape, but Gina quickly grabbed a bedside lamp and swung it at him, striking him hard in the head. Norman staggered, lost his balance, and tumbled down the stairs with a sickening thud. Gina stood there, listening to the eerie silence in the house. Slowly, she descended the stairs and saw Norman lying motionless at the bottom. She pulled out her phone and dialed emergency services. "I need help," she said, her voice shaking. "I think I just killed a man." The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Gina was overcome with horror, but she knew this was the only way out. She still held the phone as the ambulance and police arrived. Her heart pounded in sync with the sirens tearing through the night's silence. She sat on the stairs, unable to take her eyes off Norman's motionless body. "Ma'am, are you there?" The operator's voice sounded distant. "Yes, I'm here," Gina whispered. The sirens blared, their flashing lights casting dancing shadows across the walls. Gina sat on the bottom step of the staircase, gripping her phone with trembling hands. The dispatcher's voice echoed in her ears as if coming from another world. "Stay where you are and don't touch anything," the voice instructed firmly. But Gina barely registered the words. She simply nodded, forgetting that the dispatcher couldn't see her. "Yes," she finally said. Time dragged unbearably slowly. Every second felt like an eternity. She couldn't tear her eyes away from Norman, unsure if he was dead or still alive. A part of her wanted to check, but another, more rational part told her to stay put. Finally, the sirens faded, and bright blue and red lights flooded the house. Gina heard the police knocking on the door. She slowly stood up, her legs stiff from sitting so long. She walked over and opened it. Two officers stood there, their faces cautious. "Did you call the police?" one of them asked. Gina nodded. "He's in there." She pointed toward the hallway. The officers entered, scanning the house as they moved toward where Norman lay. Paramedics followed closely behind. Gina stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold as if she were witnessing a movie. "There's a pulse," one of the medics shouted. "It's weak, but he's alive." Gina's strength left her, and she sank to the floor, realizing that Norman was still breathing. At that moment, one of the officers approached her. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me. We have some questions to ask you." She nodded, feeling like she was in a dream. They led her to the kitchen and sat her down at the table. "Sergeant Brian Anderson," the officer introduced himself as he sat across from her. "Can you tell me what happened?" Gina took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. "I found out that my husband, Norman, had been abusing my son," she said, the bitterness heavy in her voice. Sergeant Anderson frowned. "Abusing? In what way?" Gina looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sexually. I had my suspicions for a while, but tonight I got proof." "What kind of proof?" Anderson asked. She closed her eyes, gathering the strength not to break down. "There's a photo album in my son's room. It has pictures of Matthew." Anderson nodded. "I understand. And what happened next?" "I confronted him. He tried to run. We struggled, and he fell down the stairs. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to stop him." Gina's voice shook, but she forced herself to continue. At that moment, another officer entered the kitchen. "Brian, you need to see this. We found something in the kid's room." Sergeant Anderson stood up but turned to Gina before leaving. "Stay here. We'll be back soon." Gina remained seated, listening to the sounds of officers and medics moving through the house. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. After a while, Anderson returned. "We found the album and reviewed your recording. Your story checks out. For now, this looks like self-defense, but you'll need to come down to the station and give an official statement." Gina nodded, feeling a slight sense of relief but knowing this was far from over. "Can I make a call? I need to speak to my son," she asked. Anderson nodded and handed her a phone. She dialed her mother's number. When she answered, Gina, barely holding back tears, asked her to wake Matthew. A few moments passed like an eternity as Gina listened to her mother walking down the hallway and opening a door. "He's sleeping soundly," her mother said. "I just need to know he's okay," Gina whispered, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on her. Her mother reassured her that Matthew was safe and that no one would go near him until Gina returned. Hearing those words, Gina closed her eyes and felt some of the tension ease. After ending the call, she was ready to follow the officer to the station, knowing there were still many challenges ahead, but hoping that, at last, she and Matthew would be safe. As they drove through the city, Gina stared out of the patrol car's window, watching the neon lights flicker in the darkness. The events of the past few days raced through her mind, but she could barely focus. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. When they arrived at the station, she was led into a small interrogation room with gray walls and a cold metal table. The room felt lifeless and suffocating, and Gina shivered involuntarily. Soon, Sergeant Anderson returned, accompanied by a female investigator dressed in a sharp suit. "Gina, this is Detective Camilla Brown. She will be handling your case," the sergeant introduced her. The detective sat across from Gina, her face serious but gentle, without a trace of judgment. "Gina, I understand you've been through a lot," Camilla said calmly, "but we need to go over everything that happened, starting from the very beginning. Take your time. Tell me everything in order." Gina took a deep breath and began her story, starting with her first suspicions, then how Matthew had confided in her about what had happened. At one point, her voice trembled, and her eyes filled with tears as she described the contents of the album. "They were photos of Matthew," she whispered, feeling overwhelmed by sadness and disgust. The detective nodded and handed her a tissue. "You did everything you could," she said softly. "Don't blame yourself for not seeing it sooner. People like him know how to hide." Gina nodded, wiping her tears, but she didn't feel relieved, just exhausted. After the interrogation, Camilla Brown confirmed that once her husband recovered, he would be charged with child sexual abuse. "As soon as he's well enough, he will be arrested," Camilla assured her. "What about me?" Gina asked quietly, afraid of the answer. "Based on your statement and the evidence we found, this appears to be self-defense," the detective explained. "However, the prosecutor's office will decide whether to press any charges against you. For now, you're free to go, but please don't leave town. We may need to speak with you again." Gina felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew there were still legal battles ahead. She took a deep breath and looked at the detective with gratitude. "Can I see my son?" she asked. "Of course. We're done here. Take your phone and call someone who can pick you up, or take a cab," Camilla said. Gina dialed her friend Karen's number. When she answered, Gina tried to hold back her tears, but her voice wavered. "Karen, can you come get me? I'm at the station." "Of course, Gina. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Karen replied. Gina felt her heart calm slightly. A short time later, she was in Karen's car, hugging her tightly when they met. Karen didn't ask any questions, just held her in a comforting embrace, and Gina felt immense gratitude for her support. By the time they arrived at Gina's mother's house, it was almost 5 a.m. "Do you want me to come in with you?" Karen asked, looking at her with concern. "No, thanks. I'll be okay," Gina replied. Karen nodded, and Gina stepped out of the car, walking toward the front door. As soon as she pressed the doorbell, the door opened, and her mother greeted her with a worried look. "Gina!" her mother exclaimed, immediately pulling her into a tight hug. Gina couldn't hold back anymore. She broke down in tears, all the pain, fear, and tension pouring out at once. "It's over, Mom," she whispered between sobs. "We're safe." Her mother held her close, gently stroking her hair like she used to when Gina was a child. "It's going to be okay, my girl. You did the right thing," she whispered, rocking Gina slightly as if soothing a child. Once Gina calmed down, they went inside, and her mother led her to the kitchen, preparing a cup of tea. "Matthew's asleep," she said, placing the cup in front of Gina. "He didn't hear anything." "Tell me everything." Gina took a deep breath and started recounting everything that had happened. She watched her mother's expression shift from shock to horror and finally to steely determination. "That monster," her mother said, clenching her fists. Her eyes burned with fury. "You should have killed him." "Mom," Gina said, stunned by her words. I'm sorry, I can't believe someone could do this to our Matthew. Gina felt tears welling up again. I don't understand how I didn't see it, she murmured. They sat in silence, both lost in thought. What do we do now? Her mother finally asked, bringing Gina back to reality. Gina sighed, knowing the road ahead would be long. We have to tell Matthew everything. Explain what happened, she said, feeling the weight settle on her again. Then there will be court cases, lawyers. I don't know how we're going to get through this. We will, Gina, her mother said firmly, taking her hand. We'll face it together, one day at a time. You're not alone. Gina squeezed her mother's hand, grateful. She knew they had a long journey ahead, but with her mother by her side, she felt like she could face it. The next morning, Gina woke up before Matthew. She watched him sleep peacefully, feeling a deep sense of relief that he was finally safe. She went downstairs to the kitchen, where her mother was already making breakfast. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Her mother asked gently, placing a cup of coffee in front of her. Like I got hit by a train, Gina admitted with a deep sigh. This is all so overwhelming, and today I have to explain everything to Matthew. Gina, this is Detective Camilla Brown. She'll be handling your case, the sergeant introduced her. The detective sat down across from Gina, her expression serious yet gentle, without a hint of judgment. Gina, I understand you've been through a lot, Camilla said, her voice calm. But we need to talk about what happened, starting from the very beginning. Take your time. Tell me everything in order. Gina took a deep breath and began her story, starting with her first suspicions, how Matthew had confessed to her about what had happened. At one point, Gina's voice trembled, and her eyes filled with tears as she spoke about the contents of the album. They were pictures of Matthew, she whispered, feeling sorrow and disgust overwhelm her. Detective Brown nodded and handed Gina a tissue. You did everything you could, she said softly. Don't blame yourself for not seeing it sooner. People like him know how to hide. Gina wiped her tears but felt no relief, only exhaustion. After the interview, Camilla Brown confirmed that once Gina's husband recovered, he would be formally charged with child sexual abuse. As soon as he's well enough, he'll be arrested, Camilla assured her. What about me? Gina asked quietly, afraid of the answer. Based on the evidence in your testimony, this looks like self-defense. But the prosecutor will decide whether any charges will be filed against you, the detective explained. For now, you're free, but don't leave town. We may need to ask you more questions. Gina felt a wave of relief wash over her, even though she knew there were still legal battles ahead. She took a deep breath and looked at the detective with gratitude. Can I see my son? She asked. Of course, we're done here. Take your phone and call someone to pick you up, or take a cab, Camilla said. Gina dialed her friend Karen's number. When Karen answered, Gina tried to hold back her tears, but her voice trembled. Karen, can you come get me? I'm at the station. Of course, Gina. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Karen said without hesitation. Gina felt her heart calm slightly. A short while later, she was sitting in Karen's car and hugged her tightly the moment they met. Karen didn't ask any questions. She just held her, offering silent support. By the time they reached Gina's mother's house, it was nearly 5 a.m. Do you want me to come in with you? Karen asked, looking at her with concern. No, thank you. I'll be okay, Gina replied. Karen nodded and Gina stepped out of the car, heading to the front door. The moment Gina touched the doorbell, the door swung open, and her mother met her with a worried expression. Gina, she gasped, immediately pulling her daughter into an embrace. Gina couldn't hold back anymore. She broke down in her mother's arms, letting out all the pain, fear, and tension. It's over, Mom, she whispered through her sobs. We're safe. Her mother held her tightly, stroking her hair the way she used to when Gina was a child. It's going to be okay, my girl. You did the right thing, she murmured, rocking her gently. Once Gina calmed down, they went inside, and her mother led her to the kitchen, making her some tea. Matthew is asleep, she said, handing Gina a cup. He didn't hear anything. Tell me everything. Gina took a sip and started explaining everything that had happened. She watched as her mother's face shifted from shock to horror and finally to determination. That monster, her mother muttered, clenching her fists. Her eyes burned with anger. You should have killed him. Mom, Gina said, startled by her words. Sorry, I can't believe someone could do that to our Matthew. Gina felt tears welling up again. I don't understand how I didn't see it, she whispered. They sat in silence, both lost in thought. What do we do now? Her mother finally asked, bringing Gina back to reality. Gina sighed, knowing the road ahead would be long. We have to tell Matthew everything. Explain what happened, she said, feeling the weight settle on her shoulders again. Then there will be trials, lawyers. I don't know how we'll get through this. We will, Gina, her mother said, taking her hand. We'll get through it together, one day at a time. You're not alone. Gina squeezed her mother's hand gratefully, knowing that the path to healing would be difficult, but with her mother by her side, she felt like she could make it. The next morning, Gina woke up before Matthew. She watched him sleep peacefully, feeling relief that he was safe now. She went downstairs to find her mother already making breakfast. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Her mother asked softly, placing a cup of coffee in front of her. Like I've been hit by a train, Gina admitted with a sigh. This is all so overwhelming, and today I have to explain everything to Matthew. Her mother sat beside her, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You'll do the right thing. He's stronger than you think, and he's not a little kid anymore. When Matthew finally woke up, still groggy, he rushed into Gina's arms. Mommy, he exclaimed, hugging her tightly. Gina felt warmth fill her heart, but knew their conversation had to happen now. Matthew, we need to talk, she said gently, sitting him down on the couch beside her. She carefully explained what had happened in a way he could understand. Do you remember what you told me about your stepfather? She asked. Matthew nodded, his expression serious. He won't be able to hurt you anymore, because I told the police everything, Gina assured him. Matthew looked away, his eyes welling up with tears. You believed me, Mom? He whispered. Gina pulled him into a tight embrace, feeling a pang in her heart. Of course, sweetheart. I always believe you, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. They sat together, holding each other until Matthew calmed down. What happens now? He finally asked. We'll stay here with Grandma until everything settles down, Gina said, and soon you'll talk to some kind people who will help us through this. She explained that police officers and psychologists would visit them to help them heal. She promised she would be with him every step of the way, that he would never be alone. Matthew nodded, squeezing her hand. Okay, Mom, I just want this to be over. The days at Grandma's house became a much-needed respite. Matthew slowly started playing again, returning to his old self. Gina watched him with relief, but she knew the legal battles were just beginning. She reached out to a family friend, a lawyer specializing in child abuse cases, and arranged a meeting. When Gina and Matthew arrived at the police station, Detective Camilla Brown led them to a child-friendly room. The walls were painted bright colors, and the floor was covered with toys and books. Matthew hesitated at first, but relaxed when he saw nothing scary in the room. Hi, Matthew. A middle-aged child psychologist named Stephen greeted him warmly. He sat on the floor near some toys and gestured for Matthew to join him. My name is Stephen, and I'm here to talk with you. You know, we have lots of fun toys here. Do you like to play? Matthew nodded and sat across from him, eyeing the building blocks on the floor. Stephen pushed a few blocks toward him. Want to build something together? He offered. Matthew took a few pieces and started stacking them, staying close to his mom. You know, Matthew, Stephen said gently, sometimes kids come here to talk about important things, things that worry or scare them. We can talk about anything you want. Matthew focused on the blocks for a moment. What if I don't want to talk? He asked quietly. That's okay, Stephen reassured him. You can tell me whatever you want, whenever you're ready. We can just sit here and play until then. Matthew relaxed a little. After a pause, he whispered, Sometimes I'm scared. I'm afraid it might happen again. Stephen nodded. I understand, but you're safe now. Your mom loves you very much, and she wants you to be happy. You never have to be afraid to tell someone if something worries you. Matthew looked at Stephen, a hint of relief in his eyes. If I tell, my stepfather won't come back. No, Stephen said firmly. He won't come back. Everything you tell us helps keep you safe. Matthew hesitated, then continued building his blocks. I don't want anyone to know. I feel ashamed, he admitted. You don't have to feel ashamed, Stephen told him gently. You're very brave for being here. None of this is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, and everyone here just wants to help you. Matthew took a deep breath, and it seemed like he felt a little lighter. Stephen continued to gently support him, talking about emotions and reminding him that he could always come whenever he needed. This conversation was Matthew's first step toward healing, and he realized that his words could bring protection, not fear. As they continued building with the blocks, Gina watched her son and felt, for the first time since everything had happened, that he was starting to return to himself. She knew this was only the beginning, but she was grateful that there were people around him who would help him through this difficult journey. On the way home, Matthew became more animated, talking about how he wanted to go back to the park and play with his friends. Smiling, Gina realized that they were starting to build a new life. Step by step, they would begin to return to normal, find a place where they felt safe, and gradually heal their wounds. Meanwhile, Norman's life had taken a drastic turn. He spent several days in the hospital under police guard, recovering from injuries he had sustained during his fall. As soon as his condition stabilized, he was transferred to a detention center. He was charged with child sexual abuse and placed in custody while awaiting trial. Gina and Matthew continued staying at Grandma's house, slowly recovering from everything they had been through. However, the legal process was just beginning, and Gina knew she would have to go through many difficult steps. Soon they were called to the first court hearing. Gina knew she would have to testify, and Matthew might have to be a witness, so she met with their attorney beforehand to discuss the next steps. Their attorney, an experienced specialist in child abuse cases, assured Gina that he would do everything possible to minimize Matthew's stress. "We'll try to have his testimony recorded on video so he won't have to appear in court," the attorney said. As the hearings began, Gina felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her once again. In the courtroom, she saw Norman for the first time since that night. He looked defeated and bitter, but was trying to maintain his composure. His attorney attempted to argue that there had been a misunderstanding and that Matthew might have misinterpreted his actions. However, the recordings Gina had provided spoke for themselves. When they were presented in court, they left little doubt about Norman's guilt. Gina sat through the proceedings with her heart aching, but she knew this was necessary to get justice for Matthew. The trial lasted several weeks, and each day drained Gina's energy. But she was supported by her mother and their attorney, who handled the case with confidence. Psychologist Stephen also helped both Gina and Matthew, meeting with them before important moments to provide emotional support. One evening, Gina received a call from their attorney. "The judge has made a decision," he said. "Norman has been found guilty on all charges and sentenced to a long prison term without the possibility of parole." Upon hearing this, Gina felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as if she had finally lifted a heavy burden off her shoulders. When she shared the news with Matthew, he took a moment to process it before quietly asking, "So, he's never coming back?" Gina hugged him tightly, looking him straight in the eyes. "No, sweetheart, he's never coming back. And you can feel safe now. We can finally start a new life. Just you and me." Shortly after, Gina and Matthew began rebuilding their future from scratch, with the help of therapists and the support of their loved ones. They slowly returned to normal life. Gina found a new job, and Matthew started school, where he made new friends. He attended regular therapy sessions to process his feelings and overcome the trauma. Over time, with patience and love, their lives began to stabilize. They moved into a new apartment, leaving the past behind. The healing process was long, but Gina knew her son had grown stronger, and so had she. Now they could look toward the future with hope, knowing that justice had been served and that together they could face any challenge that came their way. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on people like Norman, and send words of support for Matthew. This is a trauma that will stay with him for life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends and loved ones. Your support motivates us to keep working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next incredible story that's about to appear on your screen. We truly appreciate having you here with us. Check the description below for a catalog of all our stories. See you next time.